Rabies and Germs, welcome to the Taking a Stab podcast. My name's McConaughey, and today, I'd like to ask you a question in regards to conclusion. Or perhaps, more fittingly, I would like to ask you about conclusion, or the lack thereof. A few days ago, many of us celebrated Friday the 13th, October 13th, 2017. The fact that it falls the same month as Halloween only sparked the connection that the date has with the horror genre. The Friday the 13th horror film series can likely be credited a lot for hammering in that connection. A film series that has had its presence felt for nearly 40 years. Coincidentally, this year was meant to mark a return to the series on two occasions, first in January and then in October, but that obviously didn't happen. The planned 13th film in the series was abruptly cancelled, with many suggesting that Paramount made the decision to cancel the film after their other horror franchise, The Ring, failed to build any momentum with its latest Rings film. Regardless of why it was cancelled isn't really important. Although it's interesting to mention that this cancellation means it will be the longest stretch of time without a sequel. Friday the 13th was very consistent with its releases in its prime, striking while the iron was hot, and why not? The series didn't cost a whole lot to produce and always had considerable returns across the board. 1980, 1981, 1982, the fourth film arrived in 1984, then there was 1985, 86, the seventh film in 1988, and the eighth in 1989. The first large break was a 4-year gap between Jason Takes Manhattan and Jason Goes to Hell. After that, however, they had an 8-year wait before Jason X, which of course was followed 2 years later by Freddy vs. Jason, and the remake 6 years after that. A lot of films to say the least, but where I'm going with this is that this will be the first time that it'll be 9 years between films, and chances are it will likely end up being at least a decade. The question you might ask is why the series itself has been dormant for as long as it has. After all, the franchise is insanely popular and profitable, isn't it? The Jason character is a name that a lot have at least heard of, and his hockey mask is instantly recognizable. But that doesn't necessarily translate to sound box office returns. The character certainly has a cult following, but it's unpredictable. The remake made $40 million in its opening weekend, but had a downward trajectory of 80% in the weekend after. And with horror sequels, we like hitting the reset button. But except for certain special cases, follow-ups are known to lead to diminished returns. For instance, the Halloween 2 remake made effectively half of what the first film in the series made, and for a film like Friday the 13th, in its current state, it can't continue to have its returns diminished and still seem like a financially sound investment, especially for a company like Paramount, which has lost hundreds of millions because Ghost in the Shell, Monster Trucks, Baywatch, and a couple of others, while Transformers wasn't enough to pick up the slack like they might have hoped. Rings didn't flop at the box office, it simply wasn't the type of viable success that justifies such an expensive horror film. That's why the series itself hasn't carried on. Word of mouth and critical reviews for the remake suggested no real reason that any momentum was being built, and that's why no direct sequel was made, and the way Rings performed spooked Paramount about investing in the Friday the 13th series because they're walking on eggshells as of late. This could change eventually, however, as currently it looks as though the rights to the Friday the 13th franchise could revert back to Warner Brothers, which would make for a different ballgame entirely. Warner Brothers, of course, has had tremendous success in the horror genre with the Conjuring franchise, which most recently had Annabelle Creation make $300 million worldwide, and the new It film, which has so far surpassed $600 million worldwide and counting. I've reviewed both films on the NJ Today YouTube channel already. If the Friday the 13th franchise goes to Warner Brothers, that suggests that Friday the 13th could feasibly continue with a new direction altogether. But does the series itself have any reason to carry on? And what ways could it reasonably continue? I don't have a whole lot of affection for the Friday the 13th franchise as a whole. Not in the same way I had affection for Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street, or Child's Play, although I do have a certain fondness for it, and the Jason character instilled simply through affiliation. The Freddy vs. Jason film meant a lot to me as a young horror fan, even though the reoccurring consensus oftentimes labeled it as a bad film. From the opening with Freddy Krueger and his teeth stained with blood and the battles that occurred during the film, I felt that even if the film itself might not have broke new ground from a human perspective, the film really captured the essence of Freddy and Jason and let them do battle in a very satisfying way. The Friday the 13th films, however, have always felt as though they hit in a very one-note, unsatisfying way, appealing to the lowest common denominator, and I feel that it inspired many of the slasher films from the 80s to approach themselves in a very generic, formulaic manner. A lot of the horror series that started from the 80s eventually went on to embrace a cheesy or perhaps unassuming way, willing to coast and go through treading the water and going through the motions without trying to make waves. But the crux of the discussion itself isn't even in regards to how the trajectory went, because honestly, I enjoyed the Friday the 13th remake plenty, but whether or not the series itself should carry on is a different question entirely. The financial prospects suggest the series itself can't carry on in its current formulaic approach. Which brings me back to what I started this off with my proposition of conclusion, or lack thereof. Would it be better if Friday the 13th was left to die by the wayside? This is an open-ended question, and I don't suspect that I'll discover a resolution in this video, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you feel about another film. Because if I'm honest with myself, if I read about all of what the directors or producers say, even with past remakes of other series, too often it feels as though the only way anyone knows how to continue these series is by going back to the well and reapplying what worked in earlier films and seeing if it sticks again. If someone were to ask me if Friday the 13th effectively needs to carry on, I would say that the series continues to burn bridges over and over again, failing to refresh or add interesting ideas to its own concept. Whereas if someone asks me if A Nightmare on Elm Street effectively needs to carry on, I am almost always open to it, simply because Elm Street should work, even if it doesn't work most of the time. With Elm Street, you have a film series about a character that can bend reality at his whim, and effectively, that can be applied to a plethora of different narratives. For instance, Warner Brothers' new It film could just as easily have been turned into an Elm Street film, because the Freddy character is so versatile. But the problem in general with new iterations in Elm Street or Friday the 13th is that they're approached as novelties, a chance to enjoy company with familiar friends and see highlight reels of familiar elements. They aren't trying to reinvent, and the concepts and respected brand aren't molded into new visions. In a perfect world, I do think there's a really good, relevant film that needs talented bodies applying their skills to them, perhaps even approaching it less like a slasher film, with a darker, more menacing approach to it. Re-explain Jason as less of a zombie and more of a phantom, allowing a smaller, more serious appeal. Or, if you think that loses the essence too much, apply the situation to a party blowout of sorts. Allow it to have individuals running around a campgrounds, being hunted by Jason in a way that is on the order of Predator. These are all spitballing ideas of what I think could provide a new enthusiasm, and not necessarily what should be applied to the actual film. All I know is the only way I'd want a new film is if the people involved aren't looking to retread old itches with the intent of a cash grab. And if not, I'd just say leave it alone and let it die. Thanks for listening to my thoughts, and if you like this video, feel free to subscribe. And if you have any thoughts, make sure to share them in the comments below.